It was the kind of summer day that made you want to dive into cool, crystal-clear water and forget the world existed. The sun hung high in the sky, baking the neighborhood, and the only sound was the faint hum of cicadas in the distance. Emily, her backyard pool was her sanctuary, a place where she could unwind after long days at work, float on her favorite inflatable lounger, and let the stress melt away. But that summer, her peaceful oasis became the center of a drama she never saw coming. It all started innocently enough. A few kids from the neighborhood asked if they could swim in her pool. Emily, being the kind-hearted person she was, said yes. After all, she remembered being a kid herself, desperate for a way to beat the heat. But what began as a simple act of generosity quickly spiraled into something else entirely. At first, it was just the occasional dip. A couple of kids here, a few there. But word spread fast, and before Emily knew it, her pool was the unofficial hangout spot for half the neighborhood. Every afternoon, like clockwork, they'd show up, laughing, shouting, and splashing around, like they owned the place. At first, Emily didn't mind. She liked the sound of kids having fun, and it felt good to share something that brought so much joy. But soon, things started to change. The kids began showing up uninvited, letting themselves into her backyard without even knocking. They'd leave towels strewn across her patio, empty soda cans floating in the water, and crumbs from their snacks scattered everywhere. Emily tried to brush it off, chalking it up to kids being kids. But then, one day, she came home to find her pool filled with strangers, teenagers she'd never even seen before, blasting music and jumping off the diving board like it was a public water park. That was the moment Emily realized she'd lost control. Her sanctuary had been taken over, and she didn't know how to get it back. She tried talking to the kids, setting boundaries, even putting up a sign that said, "Private, pool, no trespassing." But nothing worked. They laughed it off, ignored her, and kept coming back like they had every right to be there. Emily felt trapped in her own home, her frustration growing with each passing day. She knew she had to do something, but what? She couldn't just drain the pool or call the police on a bunch of kids. And yet, the thought of spending the rest of the summer as a reluctant host to a bunch of entitled teenagers was unbearable. Then, one evening, as she sat on her patio watching the sun dip below the horizon, an idea began to form in her mind. It was bold, maybe even a little risky, but it was the only way she could think of to reclaim what was hers. She didn't know if it would work, but she was willing to try. The next day, she put her plan into motion. She didn't tell anyone what she was doing, not her friends, not her family, and certainly not the kids who'd been invading her space. She just waited, watching from her kitchen window as the first group of teenagers showed up, laughing and joking like they owned the place. But this time, Emily was ready. She stepped outside, her heart pounding, and confronted them. What happened next would change everything, not just for Emily, but for everyone involved. By the time the sun set that evening, the neighborhood would be buzzing with gossip, and the kids who'd treated her pool like their personal playground would learn a lesson they'd never forget. But what exactly did Emily do? How did she turn the tables on the very people who'd been taking advantage of her kindness? And what were the consequences of her actions? Not just for the kids, but for herself? The answers to those questions would come later. But one thing was certain. This was a summer no one would ever forget. And as Emily stood there, watching the ripples in the water fade into the night, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But that's just the beginning of the story. What happened next? Well, you'll have to wait to find out, because this tale is far from over, and the twists and turns are just getting started. So grab a seat, stay tuned, and get ready for a story that will keep you on the edge of your pool chair until the very end. Emily had always been the kind of person who went out of her way to help others. It was just in her nature. Growing up in a small town where everyone knew everyone, she'd learned early on that kindness was the glue that held a community together. So, when she moved into her new house with its sparkling blue pool, she didn't think twice about sharing it with the neighborhood kids. At first, it felt good to be the person who brought a little joy into their lives. She'd sit on the patio, with a book, glancing up every now and then to watch them splash around, their laughter echoing through the backyard. It reminded her of her own childhood summers, carefree and full of possibility. But as the days turned into weeks, something shifted. The kids stopped asking for permission. They'd just show up, sometimes in groups so large that Emily couldn't keep track of who was who. And it wasn't just the kids anymore. Older teenagers started showing up too, bringing with them a sense of entitlement that made Emily's skin crawl. She tried to ignore it at first, telling herself it wasn't a big deal. But then came the day she found a broken beer bottle at the bottom of the pool. That was the final straw. Emily had worked hard to create a peaceful, beautiful space for herself, and now it felt like it was being destroyed piece by piece. She knew she had to do something, but the question was what? She couldn't exactly confront a group of rowdy teenagers on her own. And calling the police seemed too extreme. After all, they were just kids, right? But as the days went on, the situation only got worse. The kids started showing up earlier and staying later, their noise levels growing louder with each passing. Emily's once tranquil backyard had become a war zone, and she was losing the battle. One evening, after a particularly chaotic day, Emily sat down with her best friend Sarah to vent. Sarah had always been the voice of reason in their friendship, the one who could see solutions where Emily only saw problems. "You need to take back control," Sarah said firmly, sipping her iced tea as they sat on the patio. "This is your home, Emily. You can't let them walk all over you like this." Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I know, but how? I've tried talking to them, setting rules, even putting up a sign. Nothing works. They just don't care." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she thought. "Maybe you need to think outside the box. If they're not respecting your boundaries, you have to find a way to make them." Emily raised an eyebrow. "What are you suggesting? I can't exactly build a moat around the pool." Sarah laughed, but there was a glint in her eye that made Emily pause. "No, but you can make them think twice about coming back. You just have to get creative." That conversation stuck with Emily long after Sarah left. She lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, turning Sarah's words over in her mind. What did creative even mean in this situation? She didn't want to hurt anyone or cause a scene, but she needed to send a message, one that would make it clear her pool wasn't a free-for-all. The next morning she woke up with a plan. It wasn't fully formed yet, but it was a start. She spent the day researching, jotting down ideas, and gathering supplies. By the time the sun began to set, she was ready. She didn't know if her plan would work, but she was willing to take the risk. That evening, as the first group of kids arrived, Emily stood by the pool, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath, reminding herself why she was doing this. This wasn't just about her pool, it was about respect, boundaries, and standing up for herself. She waited until they were all in the water, laughing and splashing like they didn't have a care in the world. Then she made her move. What happened next was something no one saw coming. Emily's plan was simple but effective, and it sent a clear message to everyone in the pool. The kids froze, their laughter dying on their lips as they realized what was happening. For a moment, there was complete silence, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. And then, chaos erupted. The kids scrambled out of the pool, shouting and cursing as they grabbed their towels and ran for the gate. Emily stood her ground, her arms crossed, watching as they disappeared into the night. She didn't say a word, but her message was clear. This was her pool, and she was done playing nice. But as the adrenaline faded and the backyard grew quiet again, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. She'd made her point, but at what cost? The kids would be back. She was sure of it. And when they returned, they wouldn't be laughing. They'd be angry and they'd be looking for payback. Emily knew she'd crossed a line, but she didn't regret it. She'd done what she had to do to protect her home and her peace of mind. But as she locked the gate and turned off the pool lights, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with gossip. Word of what had happened at Emily's pool spread like wildfire, and everyone had an opinion. Some people sided with Emily, saying she'd done the right thing by standing up for herself. Others thought she'd gone too far, that she'd humiliated the kids and made herself a target. Emily tried to ignore the whispers, but it was hard. She could feel the weight of their judgment every time she stepped outside. And then there were the kids themselves. They didn't come back that day, or the next, but Emily knew it was only a matter of time. She'd seen the looks on their faces as they ran out of her yard. Shock, anger, and something else she couldn't quite put her finger on. It wasn't fear, exactly, but it was close, and that worried her. As the days turned into weeks, Emily found herself looking over her shoulder more and more. She started locking her doors at night, something she'd never done before. She installed security cameras around the perimeter of her yard, just in case. And she stopped sitting outside to enjoy the pool, even though it was her favorite thing to do. It felt like she was living in a fortress, always on edge, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. But the kids didn't come back. At least not right away. And when they finally did, it wasn't at all what Emily expected. It started with a knock on her door one evening, just as the sun was setting. Emily hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the thought of answering the door made her stomach twist. But then she heard a voice, a young, nervous voice, calling her name. "Emily, it's me, Jake. Can we talk?" Jake was one of the kids who'd been coming to her pool since the beginning. He was one of the quieter ones, the kind of kid who always said please and thank you and never caused any trouble. Emily took a deep breath and opened the door. Jake stood on her porch, shifting from foot to foot, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He looked nervous, almost scared, and Emily felt a pang of guilt. "Hey, Jake," she said softly. "What's up?" Jake glanced over his shoulder like he was making sure no one was watching, then looked back at Emily. I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. We shouldn't have treated your pool like it was ours. It was wrong, and I'm really sorry." Emily blinked, surprised by his words. She hadn't expected an apology, especially not from one of the kids. "Thank you, Jake," she said after a moment. "That means a lot." But Jake wasn't finished. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's something else. The others. They're planning something. I don't know what, but it's not good. I just thought you should know." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She'd been right. The kids weren't done with her. And whatever they were planning, it wasn't going to be pretty. She thanked Jake again and watched as he walked away, her mind racing. What were they planning? And how far were they willing to go to get back at her? That night, Emily barely slept. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with possibilities. She thought about calling the police, but what would she say? That a bunch of kids were mad at her for standing up for herself? It sounded ridiculous, even to her. But she couldn't just sit back and wait for something to happen. She had to be ready, whatever that meant. The next morning, she woke up to find a note taped to her front door. It was written in messy, scrawled handwriting, and it sent a chill down her spine. "You think you won, but this isn't over. Watch your back." Emily's hands shook as she read the words over and over. She didn't know who'd left the note, but it didn't matter. The message was clear. This wasn't just about the pool anymore. This was personal. And as Emily stood there, clutching the note in her hand, she realized something. She wasn't just fighting for her pool anymore. She was fighting for her safety, her peace of mind, and her right to live in her own home without fear. But the question was, how far was she willing to go to protect what was hers? And what would happen when the kids finally made their move? The answers to those questions would come soon enough. But for now, all Emily could do was wait, and hope that she was ready for whatever came next. Because one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And the next chapter of this story was going to be even more intense than the last. So stay tuned, because things are about to get a whole lot more complicated.